Hey everyone, Jim Branscombe here, back for another edition of In the Mouth of Cinemadness. I don't know why I'm doing this voice, but whatever. This is a sub-series of the Cinematic Void vlog where I talk about movies that had a huge impact on me and basically laid the foundation for what eventually would become Cinematic Void. Now, the film I'm talking about today is probably going to be one of the more recent films. It came out in 2013, and I will admit that I'm a little biased towards it. It is a movie that, one, it's from my home state of Maryland, and two, I actually worked on this movie a little bit, so giving full disclosure before we jump into it. The film is the WNUF Halloween Special from 2013.
You're watching the WNUF Halloween Special.
It was directed by Chris LaMartina, produced by Jimmy George. They worked on the script together, and for those of you who haven't seen it, the WNUF Halloween Special is a found footage movie. It takes place in 1987, and basically the premise is that you found this VHS tape of this live broadcast from a TV station in Baltimore, Maryland, WNUF, where they're doing a ghost hunt live on air. There's a reporter and there's two ghost hunters and there's also a priest, and as things are unfolding, like what you think might be just some kind of jokey Halloween thing ends up being this really scary, really terrifying thing that's unraveling on live TV. And this is probably one of the most authentic found footage movies out there, mostly because of the premise. It's a VHS tape, and like anything they would air in the 80s, there's commercials, so there's actual commercial breaks in there. And there's a little bit of a fast forward gimmick in there to kind of speeds up the movie like pace at time to time. But overall, it's probably the only movie that's made in this time period, or 2010s, that kind of brings me back to the 80s. Now, the 80s were a big time for horror movies, and there's a lot of nostalgia surrounding it, and there's a lot of filmmakers that kind of try to tap into that era and that nostalgia, and honestly, a lot of them just kind of fail because I think they take the wrong lessons. But watching this movie is the rare time that I actually get taken back to as a kid in the 80s watching TV. It takes me back to that VHS tape that my parents taped off of TV for me as a kid with Garfield's Halloween Adventure, and It's the Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, with all the commercial breaks and stuff. And that's how I just, remember consuming media as a kid when I taped something off TV. Because I wouldn't fast forward through the commercials. That was part of the experience for me. It was just watching those commercial breaks and then going back to the show I was watching. So this really, really just kind of hit the sweet spot. Now, what I said earlier was this movie's from my home state, and I also said I was briefly involved with it. So let me rewind a little bit, pun intended, because of the format of the movie. I actually met director Chris LaMartina a few years before I moved out to LA. I mean, we were in the same kind of social circles of punk rock and movies and stuff, but we just never crossed paths. Even though we both went to Towson University and studied film, I graduated a couple years before he did. But there's two times we kind of hung out, and I can't remember the exact order that happened, so I'll start with this one. There was a local filmmaker that was doing a premiere at the Charles Theater down in Baltimore. Great art house theater, still in existence, still operational. Saw lots of great stuff there when I was living in Baltimore. And I can't remember the name of the film, but the filmmaker had contacted me and asked if they could play my fake Grindhouse trailer that I made a few years before called Werewolf on PCP.
Werewolf on PCP.
Went to the screening with my friend Bruce Holacek of Cinemadness, and we happened to run into Chris LaMartina, and he decided to come hang out and check things out. So no disrespect to that filmmaker that had invited me to the screening and let me show my fake trailer in front of their film, but the only thing I remember from it was that my trailer played really well, so it was a pretty cool day. The next time I crossed paths with Chris was actually at an audition he was holding for his film President's Day. It was him and co-writer, producer Jimmy George. Holacek and I were hanging out, and we just happened to stop by, and kind of glad we did because we got to see one of the most surreal, weird, cool things that I've ever experienced. So as they were bringing in different actors to read for the roles, Nikolai Volkov, famous pro wrestler that was in the WWF for years, came out and read for one of the roles. And it's like, oh, this is going to be crazy. Obviously, you got to cast him. But unfortunately, he probably gave one of the worst table reads I've ever seen. He was reading screen direction now and things like that, which just seemed weird because, he was a pro wrestler and, had to put on a performance for that because he wasn't really a crazed, angry, communist that was trying to destroy Hulk Hogan. He's apparently a real nice guy.
Can I tell you something as a friend? No, can I tell you something as a friend?
Yeah.
Come on in if you would, please. You're the shits, you really are.
After that, I moved to LA, and a few years later, I was friends with Chris and Jimmy on Facebook, and I saw they had a post about, they were looking for people to create some fake commercials for a project they were working on. They didn't really go into detail, they just said it was a throwback to the 80s, a found footage movie, and they needed like period authentic commercials. At that point, I was still in my filmmaking bag, so I was working on music videos and I was working on a web series, so I reached out to them and said, hey, I would love to do this. So the first thing that came to mind for me to pitch was a kind of PSA, like one of those Mothers Against Drunk Driving or anti-drug PSAs that were always like really dark and gritty.
If you don't tell your children about the danger of drugs, you may find a problem staring you right in the face. A problem that won't go away. Or even worse, one that does.
So I came up with this concept called Parents Against Partying. I wrote out a little commercial script, I sent it to them, and they signed off on it. I shot it in my living room and, had everything storyboarded, scripted out, everything, and, did a first cut, sent it to them, and gave me some notes, and which were actually really good notes, but they were really happy that I actually turned in a commercial that ran exactly 30 seconds. So I made those changes, sent it off, signed some paperwork, and that was it. It was a little bit before I actually got to see the film, but he eventually sent me a screener copy and I checked it out and I was really blown away. The authenticity of the piece, like he took the movie and ran it through a VCR maybe like 3, 4, 5, I can't remember how many times he did it, but like he aged it perfectly. And, it was kind of cool to see all the commercials and how the story would unfold, and it felt like it was something from the 80s that I would have seen as a kid. As I'm watching it, in the back of my mind, I was like, I wonder when my commercial is going to pop up. And about halfway through, I see it, and I'm just really excited that it was there and it kind of fit in and it kind of flowed with the rest of the movie. And I was really happy because, like, as a filmmaker, I made a lot of things that no one gave a shit about. So it was kind of cool to be in the context of this project that was like turned out really, really fucking cool.
Your kids go to parties. What kind of games do you think they're playing? They think it's no big deal, just harmless fun where everyone gets a turn. But they never bothered to check the rules and think they can stop anytime they want. There's many ways to play, but they all lead to the same result. Game over. Playing with drugs is playing with death.
Over the years, as WNUF was hitting the public space, it started to grow a cult following. I think it ended up on Shudder for a little bit, and basically it became a new kind of Halloween tradition, which is another rarity in this day and age. Most of the movies that people go to on Halloween, like, John Carpenter's Halloween or Halloween 3 or Hocus Pocus, things like that, they're all very established, been around for years, and they're just kind of the comfort movies. So it was really interesting and really cool to see a movie released in 2013 kind of pushing its way into that canon of Halloween staples. In 2016, when I had started Cinematic Void, I knew I was going to do an October screening, and I had been talking to Chris a little bit about, hey, if you ever happen to be in LA, let me know. I would love to do a WNUF Halloween special screening. And he actually hit me back with some dates. So I ended up putting together a screening of WNUF Halloween Special along with my favorite Halloween time TV movie, The Midnight Hour. It was at the Egyptian Theater in Hollywood, in the smaller theater, the Spielberg Theater that no longer exists, but that's where I did a lot of my early Cinematic Void screenings. We had a photo booth, all kinds of Halloween treats, and even a costume contest. And to kind of top it off, Chris, Jimmy George, and one of the stars of the movie, Helen Mary Ball, actually came out to the screening and were there to do a Q&A after the movie. It was a lot of fun, and it was awesome to watch the movie with an audience. It's been really cool watching the growing cult status around the WNUF Halloween Special and just becoming this Halloween staple that everyone enjoys. And yeah, it's cool that I have like a 30-second commercial in it, but it's even cooler that it's someone I know, someone I respect. Jimmy George and Chris LaMartina bust their ass and made all kinds of really interesting indie films that, if you haven't checked out yet, you should, like Witch's Brew, Call Girl Cthulhu, and What Happens Next Will Scare You. And just last year, Chris, along with his co-producer and star Melissa LaMartina, ended up making a sequel to WNUF Halloween Special called the Out There Halloween Megatape. Now, unlike the original WNUF, this one actually takes place in the 90s and follows a similar format and definitely kind of nails all the 90s aesthetic. And if you haven't seen that, I actually dare I say, think this one's even better than the original, and I love the original. I actually got the opportunity to host a special advance screening of the film at Midsummer Screen in 2022. Both Chris and Melissa were there. We had a really cool pre-show where I showed a bunch of Halloween commercials and movie clips while Jonah Ray of Mystery Science Theater 3000 fame did a little DJ set. And then we did a special introduction where Deanna Rooney, who I've done lots of skits with on the Cinemadness movie as well as live in theater, came out as the Spirit Halloween just to kick things off, and it was great to watch the movie. The crowd, it absolutely killed. After the film, I got to do a Q&A with both Chris and Melissa, and honestly, this ended up being one of my favorite screenings I've ever got to host, period. And at any theater, any format, just in general, it was a really cool, fun night. So yeah, my final takeaway from the WNUF Halloween special and its sequel is that, you know, nostalgia can be a deadly thing because like people tap into the wrong aspects of it. It just, you make something that's insincere, but there's nothing insincere about WNUF Halloween Special. So that wraps up this edition of In the Mouth of Cinemadness. Sound off the comments. Tell me if you watch WNUF every year around Halloween time, or maybe just tell me some of your favorite Halloween comfort staples that you put on every year. Until next time, see you in the void.
Do you believe in ghosts? All right, I'm going to take that as a yes.